I don't know if you planned it that way, Maddie, but I'm really glad you had the Walter Payton lyric there, because there are grown men that will cry at the moment they hear Walter Payton's voice. If they were Bears fans back then, gosh, no doubt. Connor O'Gara joining us here on Halftime from Saturday Down South. Connor, you had to expect this was going to happen. I think I told you late last week that we would do this. Have you been putting in requests on SEC radio on XM Sirius to play the Super Bowl Shuffle, or was I inferring too much from some tweets?
Phil, it certainly feels like it. And so for those who don't really understand the context here, I went on with Chris Doring and Alyssa Lang on Sirius XM right before you did. I was just kind of the prep before. I was the opener for the headliner, if you will. And they were gracious enough to intro me with some Super Bowl Shuffle, which, as a Bears fan, I wasn't alive for that. But basically, like the only time that people like talk about football in a positive way is they'll bring up the '85 Bears in Chicago. That's just kind of the way it is. And so to be intro with the Super Bowl Shuffle just makes me think of a happier place, a place in which my franchise can actually do something. Even though I didn't see it, I can only imagine, and that kind of is what makes it better, and it's like the cockiest thing in the history of sports.
That's right. They did it before the Super Bowl. The Steelers tried to do the same thing in 1994. They did a rap video. They started doing a rap video before the AFC Championship game, and they lost to the Chargers. So yeah, you don't do that kind of stuff.
Didn't the Mets do it in '86 too? But then they pulled it off, though.
I think so. Yeah, things were different in 1985 and 1986.
Must have been a wild world. I wouldn't
much
know.
Different. So Connor,
yeah, the Magic tried to do it. The Magic tried to do it before. I think it was before the '94 finals. I want to say. It was before they lost to Houston, and they dropped a track in the finals, and they thought it was going to go everywhere, and then they ended up getting swept, and that never saw the light of day. But yeah, if you're going to drop we're going to win a championship track, you have to be 85 Bears level of good. Otherwise, it's going to come back to bite you every single time.
Yeah. Early 90s Falcons with Too Legit to Quit. They were not 85 Bears, just not the thing at all. Connor, I know last weekend you I don't know if you watched all of these spring games, because you had told me about the guy on YouTube who kind of strings all the plays together for every spring game that is played, I think, across the SEC and maybe even Power 5. So Kentucky, A&M, and Auburn had spring games over the weekend. And I know, well, focus a little more on the Aggies and on the Tigers, because those are two teams that Arkansas plays. Arkansas, you know who the quarterback is. Like I know Sam Pittman has said that Malik Hornsby will compete for the job, but we know KJ Jefferson is the quarterback for the Razorback. Aggies and Tigers, it's not quite that cut and dry. And this mix with Texas A&M, with the experienced transfer from LSU, Max Johnson, the guy who won the job last year in Haynes King, and the big blue chip prospect in Connor Weigman, it's a pretty intriguing race there.
Yeah, so let's let the record show that there was wind in College Station. It was sunny and 75, but as Jimbo Fisher reminded us after the game, a game in which his quarterback struggled to complete a third of their passes, that is, the guys competing for the starting job, which is Max Johnson and Haynes King. Those guys struggled to complete a third of their passes, and Jimbo says afterwards, I think the weather had something to do with that. It wasn't a great showing for the quarterbacks. I'm not really going to necessarily say that they're in trouble at the quarterback position because of how they looked in the spring game, but it is a really interesting battle because it's kind of this classic known versus the unknown case. Haynes King is the unknown. We saw him for a game last year, and then a quarter against Colorado, and then he goes down with a season-ending injury, and you're kind of like, well, he won the job, and he was going into this year in 2021 is, in my opinion, one of the most intriguing players in all of college football. I thought he was the X factor in the SEC who kind of could have pushed A&M over the top. I thought they had the defense to out, but they just did not have the right quarterback. And so now this year, what does he look like coming off of the injury? What does Max Johnson look like in a new offense? I would not like to have to cram and learn Jimbo Fisher's offense in 2 months and then have to go, be in front of a national audience. Like ESPN Plus is national, but you know what I mean. Neither of them looks really good. And Connor Weigman, the 5-star who comes in with just all of this hype, he looked better, but he was also in a different setting in terms of facing the backups, and Jimbo would put him on short field. So I didn't really take away a ton from this other than it's going to be a little bit more of a learning curve than we probably realized for both quarterbacks who are each kind of dealing with their own different situations.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other teams that Phil mentioned that have a spring game last weekend, Auburn, what's it going to be at that quarterback position? I mean, Zach Calzada, obviously the transfer from A&M. You got TJ Finley and the freshman Holden Greer. Who's going to really emerge from there? Kind of just on the page, you would think it's Zach Calzada's job to lose.
Well, I'm actually kind of wondering if it's going to be the guy that you didn't mention, Robbie Ashford, the transfer from Oregon, who hasn't played a down of football at the FBS level and is going to be entering year 3 as a baseball player. And he was kind of involved in this weird Bo Nix trade to Oregon. And he comes in now having not really a lot of experience and not really having any sort of game plan on him. We'll talk about the known versus the unknown with A&M. It's kind of the same thing with Auburn. TJ Finley's the known. We've seen TJ Finley kind of struggle in a relatively limited sample size, but he's still got like a full season's worth of SEC snaps. And so if I'm Brian Harsin, I'm looking at this situation thinking I need to save my job this year. I need to have a guy who I can truly rely on to give me a top 15 type season. And Zach Calzada coming into the spring dealing with a shoulder issue is a big setback. He wasn't able to play in the spring game. So we get a full dose of Robbie Ashford. And I was kind of impressed. I kind of came away from it thinking, all right, you know what? Now that we've seen him a little bit, we've kind of seen the skill set. If Brian Harsin ends up going with him because he's not necessarily in a position where he has to play favorites and worry about a bunch of guys transferring, I would at least understand the logic behind it. I still think that it would be wise to go out and get JT Daniels. It doesn't look like they're going to do that. It looks like he's going to be deciding between 3 other schools. But, yeah, the Auburn quarterback situation I don't think is great, and I think that we saw a little bit more of that on Saturday.
One of the biggest stories around Arkansas, of course, during this offseason is keeping Kendall Briles and Barry Odom. And, you know, both of them talked to the media over the weekend, talked about how much they love Arkansas, how much they love the players that they have coming back, and the continuity to keep a staff together, to keep that culture from all 3 of the head coach, OC, and DC together is so rare in college football these days. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Arkansas is only one of 3 Power 5 schools that has the same head coach, offensive coordinator, and DC from last year. So when you look at the main 3 coaches on the football staff, where would you rank Arkansas in the SEC compared to, you know, all the other SEC teams, head coach, OC, and DC as a group?
I'd have to really do a pretty in-depth breakdown of that, but you'd probably have to put it somewhere near 5, 6, and the continuity is a big part of that. I think you could look around the SEC and have questions with a lot of these different coordinators. Look at Ole Miss. Lane has the best regular season in Ole Miss history, and then he has both coordinators poached by bigger programs and to take the same roles at another school. And that's a tough pill to have to swallow, I think. You know, Jeff Lebby, we assumed, is kind of destined for bigger and better things, but to go and take an offensive coordinator position at another school, and then to have DJ Durkin have a good year with that defense after they were just a train wreck in 2020, and then he goes to A&M and he takes the same position. Arkansas hasn't had to deal with that just yet, and there are some on the outside who would say, you know what, the raw numbers aren't really that good for Barry Odom. He's kind of overrated, and Kendall Briles and his background, he's not necessarily a candidate to get these head coaching jobs. Of course, he's going to be able to kind of stick around Arkansas for a little bit. I just don't think we could take any of that for granted when there are always seemingly teams that want to poach, and Arkansas has been able to hold on to that, and they do have one of the better groups, and that's why I think some of them will be sipping, you know, a little bit of the Kool-Aid in terms of the national media talking about Arkansas. If you don't have that continuity, we ask more questions, but having that in place is maybe the biggest thing that they have working in their favor going into 2022.
Don't you feel like some of this has to deal with the idea of what it's like to work for Sam Pittman? You know, and I don't know what Lane Kiffin is like personally. You know, or what he, you know, exactly what he's got his fingerprints on as far as the offense is concerned and all of that. But I mean, it doesn't feel, you've interviewed Coach Pittman enough times to have a sense of it not just being what you see on press conferences and on the sideline. There's something different about him. He doesn't, and not to say that every other coach makes it about him, but he like, I believe him when he deflects the praise. I believe him when he says he doesn't micromanage. I don't always believe when I hear coaches say those things, but Sam Pittman is just an incredibly genuine person, and that's got to extend to the way that his assistants feel about him, what it's like to work for him.
I think that's really difficult, especially in the SEC, in a conference that is so demanding of the head coaching position and is so heavily scrutinized, to not necessarily micromanage and to empower your assistants. I don't think that's a given, that everybody's able to process what that's like. And we talked about it a lot with Ed Orgeron and kind of his shortcomings in the last 2 years, and some of the micromanaging that he would do on the offensive side of the ball with Jake Peetz. And he's like, I want him to get up to the line of scrimmage faster. And he's annoyed by things like that. And Jake Peetz would kind of push back and say, well, you need to be able to kind of process what the defense is doing. And that's exactly what we were doing in 2019. So, like, there are just different things with head coaches that I think are challenging to manage. And for somebody that had never been in that spot before, we didn't know how Sam Pittman was going to empower his assistants. We didn't know if all of a sudden he was going to become an egomaniac and he was going to be a different person than the guy who was beloved as an offensive line coach in this conference. And so to empower your assistants and to be in that spot and to be willing to give them credit is just, it's not a given. Lane Kiffin, I think his situation with Jeff Lebby, he tried to empower Jeff Lebby as much as possible. But Jeff Lebby saw the writing on the wall and saw, look, as long as I'm here, Lane Kiffin is always going to get a certain amount of credit for what they do on the offensive side of the ball. And he goes to Oklahoma, where he's got total autonomy with Brent Venables to now be the offensive coordinator. And I think that there are a lot of people who look at that situation, they kind of get it. Whereas with Sam Pittman, it's like, well, hey, both of these guys have total autonomy. They both are empowered, and Sam Pittman's not doing anything to kind of mingle into what they're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Connor, I'm going to steal this from our very own Ty Richardson. He brought this up this morning, but I thought it was a good little question to ask. Nick Saban was at the Masters this weekend. Is he the college football coach you'd most like to watch a golf tournament with, to be in Augusta with, or is there somebody else you'd rather hang out in the gallery with?
Pittman would be up there. I mean, he'd have to be. Pittman would just be, he would be a blast. I don't know what Saban is like commenting on other things, right? Like, we see Saban mic'd up at the spring game, and I love that he does that, whereas you have certain coaches who are they're so anal about what gets out during the spring game that they don't want anything shown on TV or anything. Meanwhile, Saban's like mic'd up. Outside of that, though, we really don't see him kind of commenting on like other things. We don't necessarily get to see him in some of these coaches' room type settings during a national championship because, oh, by the way, he's playing in them. Mm-hmm. I think I would probably defer to somebody like Pittman, who, in my opinion, his commentary would be fantastic. He doesn't hold anything back. He's not necessarily trying to say the politically correct thing. I don't feel like he would be annoyed with my presence, which I would constantly be worried about Saban being annoyed by my existence and saying the wrong thing, like kind of walking on eggshells a little bit. Pittman's just a guy you could be able to have a great time with. So I probably wouldn't put Saban there. Now, would I love to be part of a Saban golf foursome? Absolutely, of course. Those conversations would be fantastic. If I could just get out on a golf course with Saban, Lane, and then, Feinbaum, that group would be unbelievable. But yeah, I probably wouldn't pick him to follow him for the entire day, just out of fear that I was going to say something to kind of upset him and ruin his mood.
Yeah, it's probably a good idea. I would feel a little too much pressure in that case. Connor, we'll let you go. Appreciate you, man. Just once with the Super Bowl shuffle, but I'm never going to get that out of my head. Appreciate you, man.
Online is your number one source for all your betting needs, sports info, and odds. Find all the latest sports developments, including this week's odds for the Masters Championship and the start of Major League Baseball season. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino and poker games. It's super easy to get started, so join today. Learn why everyone is saying BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to wager on popular sports and games. BetOnline, where the game starts.